I don't know the answers to all of these problems. I just think what we're doing, we need to stop doing.
Mm,
Like we need to question the taxes. Like people say, everyone always complains about taxes, but when you see the number, like literally the tax take, the federal tax take as a percentage of GDP bottomed in about 2015 and now is at a 25-year high, perhaps it is not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. You know what I mean? When you see the number of public sector employees
mm,
dominates the growth in total employment. So from 2019 or 20, I can't remember now. Shit, I'm screwing this up. But like over the last 3 or 4 years, something like 40% of all employment has been in the public sector. Now, okay, people will say, well, Rich, we need, people, our society is getting older. We need more we need more nurses and doctors, but the healthcare outcomes are worse. The waiting times are worse. Educational outcomes are not as good as they used to be. So there's like a misalignment between the idea that you need more money versus what is the outcome that you're getting for that money. The other part that's really important. So like, how do I solve this problem? I don't know. The first thing is sort of addressing those concerns. The other thing is I think there's like incredible amount of low hanging fruit for Canada. But as a philosophy, the people who have been leading our country are not interested in pursuing, in my view, that low hanging fruit. I mean, besides the fact that they've demonstrated that in their language, besides the fact that some of them have written books about it, the legislative record is very, very clear. They're not interested in allowing industry to do its thing. Their view is that the problem for a government screw up is more government. And I'm submitting, as someone who believes in a strong welfare state, who believes in relatively or free healthcare, or well funded schools that kids don't have to get into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt into. The answer to our problems is not more government and more taxes. That cannot be the issue, as demonstrated by literally a productivity emergency that we're facing. And so there has to be just a change in philosophy about the role of government and why it's there and who does it benefit and whose job, like
mhm.
who are their masters, like it's not like they are our masters. It's not the other way around. And I think that the other thing I think ultimately, that we're dealing with is the other thing that also hurts the productivity emergency is we're dealing with sort of the fallout of a housing bubble. And I think that that happens to every country that deals with sort of that massive misallocation of capital. As the tide goes back out, you just have sort of this sort of a collateral damage. And I think that's also a factor, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Jeez. Okay, so what happens when I say this? I mean, it's just a lot to think. My mind just goes to where this leads in the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years. And any path I kind of paint forward or I extrapolate forward based on the data that I'm looking at, I'm like, I don't see how this just doesn't really get worse. Like, I don't know
It
about
will
you,
get
but
worse. It
yeah,
will get
right.
worse.
I'm so excited to see the next budget. Like, I'm really excited for this budget because
It makes
it's
fun of
going to
us.
be a horror show. They should just release it on Halloween. Just put it on Halloween. Say, hey, this is
Mhm.
going to be a horror show. But I can't wait to see these numbers because in the real estate market, we look around and we can see kind of like on the streets what's happening in the real estate market. And that's a big percentage of the Canadian economy, rightly or wrongly, as we've been discussing. But if that is as affected as I think it is, I just don't know where this budget kind of comes in. So then the next few years just to me means, oh, they're going to just print more money to paper over that. And like, it just seems like we're on this path and I don't know where it just leads. It's confusing. And then as
I
an
mean,
investor, where
ultimately, there's a political angle to all of this, which is the people who voted for this current administration fundamentally are not impacted by all the negative things that have been happening, right? Like, sorry, that wasn't very articulate. Meaning, they
no, that's
ultimately
fair. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
older people who like listen. Overwhelmingly, it was a tight election, but when you cut it up by demographic, the people over the age of 65 fundamentally were scared off by the boogeyman of Donald Trump. Let's just call it what it is, and
Yeah.
the trolling of him, invading Canada, which is absurd.
Mhm.
It is absurd. We need to call it out. We share a 4,000-kilometer unguarded border with the largest military empire that's ever known. It was a fantasy that was amplified by a media that ultimately knows who its paymaster is. Let's just be very transparent about that. What's frustrating for me is that those baby boomers ultimately are not impacted by the housing crisis. They already own their homes. They're not impacted by the educational crisis. They're not, the
Yeah.
immigration crisis that has affected young people, especially. They're not in. That doesn't impact them. And so, what I think you need ultimately, I know people are not going to like this, is for more pain. You need the you need more pain, because that is the only way people will recognize that the path they're on has demonstrably been the wrong one, but now it's affecting them, really. And I think the
Mhm.
next election, when it comes, I think that the distraction that was Donald Trump, I think will fall flat, because people will have, it's like a one shot. I think it's a one
Yeah, like the
shot.
boogeyman was already played. That card was already
Yeah,
played. Yeah.
yeah. And this idea that Canada is going to pivot wholesale to Europe, it's a fantasy. When it comes to
Mhm.
trade, proximity, and in Canada's case, pipelines matter. Canada's 400,000 kilometers with
Mhm.
a pipeline with the United States. 400,000 north-south pipelines with the United States. We export 93% of our oil, which is 30% of our total exports. Our like we can't even do interprovincial trade properly, and we think we're going to somehow pivot our entire economy to selling what to Europe. They're not going to receive our agricultural products. Their agricultural lobby is as strong as anybody's in the world. Apparently, they no longer want to consume oil, which is of course bullshit.
Mhm.
So, and so I just think, and more importantly, just in general, European economy is flatlining. Germany's in a recession. The UK is in a world of hurt. France's budget woes are worse than virtually any rich countries in the world. Italy's population is shrinking. Who knows what Spain is too small, really, although Spain's doing okay, it's really too small. So I just described to you something like 80% of the EU GDP, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. And all the rest of the periphery are frankly not that important. So we've got two customers, Asia. What does Asia want? Asia wants our natural resources and maybe a few little esoteric manufactured goods. And then we have the United States. And so Canada has to make a choice. How, instead of saying we're going to end the relationship with America because they said some mean things and put pressure on us when we didn't like it, we have to be honest about sort of what we want for the future of Canada. And I think I think sovereignty is probably the single most important thing. And how do you really achieve sovereignty? You achieve sovereignty by sort of replicating what John A. Macdonald did in the 1860s, which is by linking Canada ever closer together. So in the 1860s, America was saber rattling around, invading Canada, and so the deal that John A. Macdonald made with the British Columbia, which was a British colony at the time, was if we build a cross-country railway system, will you join this new country called Canada? British Columbians said yes. John A. Macdonald built the railway, and two disparate colonies became one. And Canada has another opportunity. And in effect, history is very much repeating, where we've got this boogeyman who's threatening, quote unquote, threatening the sovereignty of Canada. And we have an opportunity, to me, that's very, very obvious. And that's to further stitch west to east, and east to west via pipeline. And I don't just mean one pipeline. I mean the suite of pipelines that you would need for a sovereign, independent, and energy secure nation, which is natural gas and crude oil and the refineries and all those stuff.
Mhm. I was going to say, and the refiners. Yeah.
Because people talk about bringing manufacturing, just as a silly example, right? Like this current government wants to raise defense spending from 1% of GDP to 5 or something, right? It's like 1.5 of like squishy stuff, and then like 3.5 like proper guns and bullets and things. And in order to do that, they want to have a procurement that's domestic, right? They want to increase the domestic procurement of those, let's say, defense things from Canada. But we don't we can't. That's literally it's a fantasy, because we don't manufacture enough goods to meet even the most basic of that sort of new demand. And part of the manufacturing is having access to relatively stable and cheap energy. Guess what Canada has certain infinite amount of cheap and relatively stable energy. So, and I don't, by the way, I'm not just saying that natural gas is the be all end all, but like, building nuclear power plants, like, etc. I mean, how are we
Yeah.
going to process all these rare earth minerals that apparently are, like our neighbors and allies want? You need massive amounts of energy to do that. It's extremely, extremely energy intensive to process rare earth and critical minerals. And so that ultimately, it's really the energy industry that I think is really the forefront of how Canada can become a more stable and sovereign nation that is not as dependent on the United States. And that's the irony. The irony is just profound, right? Like, that's the ticket is that it's not just digging, it's not just crude oil and oil sand. It's like the suite of capacity that we have on offer that we just insist really on ignoring.